So, Emily, I feel like I've got a language confession to make to you.
Language confession? Okay, hit me.
I don't know if I should be embarrassed by this, but...
Don't be embarrassed. This is a safe space, babe. Safe space.
Are you sure? Okay, fine. Right. Well, here goes. I don't know if I'm totally clear on the difference between an initialism and an acronym. No, I know they're not exactly the same, but I don't exactly know why they're different. Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing, Tom. That's very brave of you.
It feels good to have it lifted off my chest, a weight lifted.
Yeah. I also think that you are not alone. And here's my understanding of it. I cannot claim to be the gospel, but here's my understanding of it. An initialism is where you say all the letters, like in USA, you say USA.
Okay, right, yeah, because I wouldn't say USA.
An acronym is where the letters are there, but you make a word out of it, like UNICEF.
And LOL is an acronym.
LOL's an acronym. WTF is an initialism. You wouldn't say WTF, you would say WTF.
Which means what, Emily?
Hello, and welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show.
She's Emily Swaddle.
And I'm Tom Praviti.
No.
I got it wrong. And he's Tom Praviti.
And this is episode 2 of our carbon removal policy deep dive. And in this episode, we're going to zoom in on some of the big policy headlines.
That's right. We've got real-world examples of CDR policy, both that is in operation already and stuff that's in development. We're also going to help to decode some of those acronyms and initialisms that we inevitably stumble across as we navigate through the world of CDR.
So many acronyms. Oh, TMI. TMI. I've just lost track at this point.
Too many initialisms, TMI. But also, I don't know, TP. I think there's always room for one more.
I see what you did there, Emily.
Someone should definitely set the initialism counter for this episode because they're going to be coming at us thick and fast.
And a prize to the listener who writes in with the exact number of initialisms that we mention, I think from now on.
Okay, so from now. But let's kind of use the term prize quite loosely. Maybe they just get a thank you from us. Maybe a GIF.
GIF, another acronym. Acronym, I believe.
I didn't even know that was an acronym. GIF. I thought it was just a fun word.
Shall we briefly recap what we touched on in the last episode?
Yes, we should. I would say, listeners, if you haven't heard that one, don't skip it. It has important context for what we'll go into here. Don't worry, we'll still be here when you're done.
We covered some real fundamentals, like what do we mean by CDR policy, the complexities that CDR policy has to achieve, and we also had a look back at how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, CDR policy really does have a lot to achieve. Please, give us regulations for this marketplace. Give us standards for our removals. Give us ways to honour and maximise the co-benefits. I could go on.
Not asking for much, are we here?
And also do all of this with one eye on local context and the other eye on global impact. Thank you so much. What stood out for you in the last episode, Tom?
Loads. I mean, I'm learning a lot in these episodes. In particular, I could really see these different approaches. You know, on the one hand, we've got the UN level really setting the bar in terms of ambitions or frameworks, which then filter down to other layers of policy making. But on the other hand, there are also these more bottom-up approaches where the local level can come first.
Yeah, it does feel like there is always news coming from the UN level. Or maybe that's just the news that gets the headlines.
Well, lots of people are excited about what's going on at the UN level. Should we start there?
Okay, top down, bottoms up. Let's dive in. The UN. Initialism for the United Nations, established in 1945, currently has 193 member states.
As we know, the UN sets the framework for global net emissions reductions, and countries set their own targets under what's called an NDC, or Nationally Determined Contribution.
Oh, you're really getting the hang of these initialisms. Love it.
It's one of my first, won't be my last.
Excellent.
When I say UN, it's actually the UNFCCC, which comes under the UN umbrella, and is another fancy initialism which stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Net emissions reductions, as we know, includes removals, and so far countries can include homegrown CDR to count towards their NDCs. The question that has been on the table for a while now is what happens when countries start purchasing CDR credits from other countries? And it's an ongoing question.
Yes, because now we're not just talking about national emissions, we're looking at global emissions as a whole. Carbon dioxide without borders, you may say. Les émissions sans frontières. That could be another initialism, I feel. My French isn't good enough.
I mean, we're doing initialisms in other languages now. I mean, we are really... This is top quality content. But yes, exactly. And managing a global marketplace becomes tricky.
Historically, back in the Kyoto days, there was something called the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM. The CDM did allow for some trading between nations. It basically allowed more developed countries to fund projects in developing countries and count these towards their own targets. These might be things like wind farms, energy efficiency projects, or methane capture at landfills, and did include some projects we might recognise as CDR, specifically a limited range of reforestation, afforestation initiatives. This is not a global market mechanism because participating nations were focused on their own targets without an eye on the bigger picture. And as you might imagine, these types of projects weren't always without controversies. The Clean Development Mechanism saw many problems with overcrediting, limited sustainable development benefits, or dubious additionality.
Quick reminder, additionality in these cases means ensuring that projects wouldn't have happened anyway, regardless of the input from developed nations.
Yeah. Ironically, the Clean Development Mechanism sounds like a bit of a mess.
Yeah, needs some cleaning up. Given the shortcomings of the CDM and the shift under the UN Paris Agreement to all nations committing to global reductions rather than just developed nations looking inward, a new mechanism was needed. Meet Article 6. Something that I imagine many of our listeners know something about, or have at least heard of.
Big CDR policy headline right there.
Indeed, the subject of much CDR chatter.
So what is its function exactly?
Essentially, Article 6 seeks to establish international rules for carbon markets and cooperation between countries in reducing global net emissions. It would allow nations to trade emissions reductions and carbon removals to meet their climate targets under their nationally determined contributions. Parts of Article 6 have sometimes been seen as a successor to the CDM, but it's a much broader and hopefully more robust effort to create something a bit different and to lay the groundwork for a compliance-grade carbon market at the UN level.
No wonder it's stolen all the headlines.
We're still in the early days of all this, Emily, but hopes are high. Here's Sebastian Manhart, who we heard from in the last episode.
Right now, the UN market is basically non-existent, but frankly, it hopefully will become the main market for carbon removals. At the high level, we've got net zero commitments. We've got nationally determined contributions from most countries on this planet. So we have the roadmap. What we're creating now through Article 6 are channels for those countries to achieve their NDCs with essentially trades and exchanges with other countries. So the potential here is huge.
So why would we want to trade carbon credits in this way between countries in the first place?
Well, when we're talking about trading credits, we're of course talking about both reductions and removals. But let's think specifically about scaling CDR, something that we all know we need. The hope is that if trading of removals is formally recognised within the framework of NDCs, it could significantly drive up demand for CDR credits.
Yeah, that could be a great avenue for scaling.
More broadly, trading compliance-grade credits between nations allows for more flexibility in reaching climate targets. We know that there are some instances in which it is currently unfeasible to just rapidly decarbonise.
Right. And I suppose that it's the most big polluting countries that will need to buy most credits. So countries with fewer resources or those that can mitigate emissions at a lower cost could stand to benefit financially from participating in such a marketplace. So I guess there's a case that it promotes equity in the net zero transition.
And this system also provides an incentive to innovate because it rewards companies and countries that find cost-effective ways to reduce or remove emissions faster than others.
Ah yes, the race to cheaper removals.
the race is well and truly on. But beyond all of this, it's also about fixing some of the weaknesses in the VCM, the voluntary carbon market, and making sure that carbon removal actually helps us get towards net zero.
The other benefit is it eliminates all the discussion about double counting that you have with the voluntary carbon market. If things happen within a Paris Agreement umbrella, it's 100% single counting, like it's all within the same accounting system, whether it's a corporate buying it or whether it's a government buying it. So it has a lot of benefits.
This is essential. Double counting occurs when the same carbon credit is counted more than once in a different reporting or accounting system. And this is a real concern, particularly when credits are used to support net zero claims or establish compliance with a country's NDCs.
So let's think about an example. A US-based company might buy credits from a biochar project in India. Purchase is made, carbon removed, post it on LinkedIn, everyone's happy. But if there are no rules in place, or if the system doesn't have robust protection against double counting, there is a risk that these credits could be claimed by both the country of the buyer and the country of the supplier when they're calculating their national net emissions. So that credit is counted by the US and India. Obviously, we can't have that because it implies twice as much carbon has been removed from the atmosphere.
Now, if you've been following the progress of Article 6 over the last few years, you'll probably know that there are two parts that are going to be key to getting this all set up: 6.2 and 6.4. Sebastian explains the difference between them.
Article 6.2 and 6.4 have to be dealt with and seen very differently. Article 6.2 is a decentralized mechanism that's already up and running, where governments can bilaterally strike an agreement to exchange anything. It can be a carbon removal, it can be an emission reduction, it can be an avoidance, it can even be carbon storage, under terms that they decide. And in fact, we already have countries starting to do this. Switzerland is leading the way. They already have 12 bilateral agreements. They're trying to actually exchange carbon removal with Norway, which is really interesting, 1 ton, but just to kind of show how it works. The challenge with Article 6.2 is it could include anything. There's almost no oversights. There's no standards. It's decentralized. And so without strong public accountability mechanisms and involvement from this industry, and this is a call to action, we need to make sure that 6.2 becomes a force for good, because it could easily become, honestly, a nuclear bomb for the sector. Because imagine if we have these governments doing deals under a supposedly UN umbrella, and suddenly there's some really bad apples in there. This could be way worse than what happened in the voluntary carbon market. So 6.2, operational today, carbon removal companies can team up with governments today, and we can start doing trades under this for carbon removal today. Fantastic. Let's make sure it has a high standard.
Right. So 6.2 is about 2 countries getting together and agreeing to some exchange of carbon credits. 2 countries, bilateral, 6.2. Got it.
Yeah, and that's operational already, as Seb mentioned.
Yeah, and there are still questions about getting the implementation right, making sure it runs smoothly and doesn't just blow up in our faces when in the hands of bad actors.
Exactly. That's 6.2. 6.4, however, is an altogether different beast.
6.4, the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanisms, or PACM, is a centralized mechanism, which has a lot of benefits. It means that we will have standards. We will have quality thresholds, right? If you do a biochar exchange or trade under Article 6.4, it will be the same, no matter which governments are involved or which companies are involved. The second thing is it's open to companies. This is for companies to also trade between each other or to trade with the government. And so it opens up to the players that are currently in the voluntary carbon market. The challenge here, again, is a potential race to the bottom. In 6.4, there are not going to be thresholds for permanence or different units. Everything's going to be treated the same. A temporary removal from nature-based solutions is going to, on paper, have the same value as a direct air capture credit, which again creates a problem, because then you will have governments probably, or companies probably, racing to the bottom and taking the cheapest stuff. So I think a lot of advocacy work is still needed. Note that there are no methodologies yet for permanent carbon removals. This will take a few more years. So it's operational, but not for permanent carbon removals today. And again, it's up to us to try to advocate for some of these quality and permanence differentials, because otherwise it could become a race to the bottom as well.
I can see the exciting potential here. Having that level of standardization would be huge. But Sebastian raises some notable concerns.
Yeah, it does feel like we're just coming back to the same potential issues we always bump into in the world of carbon crediting. We don't want to build a system that allows companies or countries to just greenwash their way towards their climate goals and NDCs. If there's not proper management around the quality of carbon credits, it feels inevitable that low-quality, cheap credits will take centre stage. And actually cutting emissions or buying quality CDR credits will just be much less appealing.
It's definitely going to be tricky, and I'm glad it's not me that's setting the rules here. The actual implementation of this is going to be complex, and it's almost certainly going to be fraught with debate, whether that's around transparency, robust verification, etc., etc.
Which I guess is inevitable. If we've learned anything about CDR over the past 4 years, it's that it's not a simple one-and-done solution. So I suppose we need that debate. It's all an important part of this.
And that takes time. So although 6.4 has been the hot topic for a while already, we're still some way from seeing durable CDR like DAX and BEX and others integrated into it. But I don't expect the conversation in carbon removal circles to die down anytime soon. Here's Eva Tammer, who we also heard from in the last episode.
I will take some credit on why removals community thinks of Article 6 on myself and on the blog post I wrote some time ago when there were some troublesome moments in the supervisory body meetings where removals were being discussed. I didn't expect that the whole community suddenly will realize that Article 6 is the place to engage with. But what actually came out of it was a great education for everyone who was sitting on the supervisory body of the Article 6.4 mechanism. And that's a good thing. So I think from Article 6 perspective, that mechanism is first and foremost going to see the projects that are currently under clean development mechanism being transitioned under Article 6.4. And expectation of seeing any kind of novel removal projects there is quite far off still, because there are even no methodologies established for that yet. I would say we'll need to wait and see. I think it's more important to see what is going to happen in the UK, what is going to happen in the EU. You know, in a few decades, all markets should become carbon removal markets, whether they are compliance markets or voluntary markets or international markets under Article 6. But we're still quite far away from that time. There are developments happening in parallel, especially if you draw the lines between Article 6 process and the EU carbon removal and carbon farming regulation, then at some point they were really going with the same speed. So there are many things happening at the same time.
In terms of the Article 6.4 timeline, we're likely to see the first batch of methodologies for reductions projects to be approved over the coming months. Yes. And we could see some credits hitting the market in a very similar time frame.
I can tell you're excited about that, Tom. I'm excited for you.
It is exciting. It's very exciting. It's very promising.
I also want to know what else is going on besides the UN level stuff. Ava also mentioned regional and national level policy developments that are happening in parallel. Thank goodness.
Absolutely. I think it's time to explore some of the other policy frameworks that are happening around the world.
Agreed.
Beyond the UN level, there's a lot of attention on the EU.
EU. European Union. Another geographical initialism.
We did warn you, listeners.
Not only is the EU the world's second largest economy, but it's seen by many as a pioneer on climate policy, often setting standards that go on to be adopted internationally. So it's an important player, both in practical terms and symbolically.
EU law mandates climate neutrality by 2050, with intermediate targets between now and then. And, like at the UN level, this has triggered a need to define the role of removals. So the bloc is now developing dedicated frameworks for CDR and moving towards defining and integrating compliance-grade removals.
But let's just start by zooming out a bit, shall we? The EU's overall climate policy is based on its reductions targets, with 3 sector-based pillars working to deliver those targets across different industries. Ava explained more.
These pillars have been the ETS, emissions trading system, effort sharing regulation, which covers all sectors that are outside the emissions trading system. And then we have the third pillar, which is land use change, and forestry. And basically all these three pillars also form their own directives or regulations, and they have either EU-level targets or member state-level targets, and they are driving emissions down. And in the case of land use legislation, forestry, also they are, driving the enhancement of sinks. So these are the key tools.
So the third pillar, LULUCF, is already factoring in the removal capabilities of natural sinks in the EU's formal carbon accounting.
Hold on one quick minute, Tom. LULUCF?
Mm-hmm.
That's like an acronym-initialism hybrid, like an acronymism or an initialism.
Whatever it is, it's probably my favourite so far.
Yeah, it's definitely my favourite.
It's a top tier acronymism, whatever we're going to call that. And it stands for land use change, and forestry.
LULUCF.
But the other two pillars, that's the ETS, or emissions trading system, which covers power, industry, aviation and maritime, and the ESR, or effort sharing regulation, which covers things like other transport, buildings and agriculture and waste. They haven't historically given a role to removals in helping to meet their respective targets. But this is expected to change.
Now with removals becoming more into focus, the challenge is that today the only removals part of EU targets are the LULUCF-based removals. So that's the 2030 target, which doesn't even consider BECS, DACs and so on. And that will need to change. So now the question is, will the three-pillar system have yet another pillar added to it that has removals, novel removals? Or will these novel removals be added into these existing three pillars? Or is it going to be built up somehow differently compared to what it is today?
Big questions. Changes are coming. That feels pretty inevitable, but what that change looks like is just not clear yet.
Now, sectors that we might traditionally think of as hard to decarbonise and producing hard to abate emissions come under the ETS pillar, the emissions trading system. So there's quite a bit of focus on whether removals could have a role to play in the existing framework there.
Yeah, the ETS is essentially a cap and trade system that puts a price on carbon by requiring emitters to hold allowances or permits equivalent to their emissions. I can see how, in theory, integrating removals into the ETS could be fairly feasible, right?
Ava has more on how the ETS came to be.
We couldn't put in place carbon tax in Europe because tax-related decisions require unanimity of all EU member states, and we knew that's never going to happen. So trading system was the most reasonable alternative to explore. So in the EU context, the targets kept creeping up, right? We had the EU ETS in the beginning, and this kind of only 8% reduction target between 2008 to 2012. But then things get bigger. We had these 2020 targets, which were kind of called 2020 targets because 20% reductions on greenhouse gas emissions, and then also two targets for energy side that were also both 20%. So we got to the 20, and then for 2030, now we have the 40% reduction targets. We know that for 2050 in the climate law, the EU has climate neutrality, which basically many people associate with net zero. And the big question mark these days is going to be what the 2040 targets will look like, which is then supposed to show how we're actually going to get from the 2030 target to the 2050, which is, I would say, that the hardest part of the trajectory to actually make happen.
This is a really useful reminder that policies at all levels are often a result of practical and procedural considerations. Because of the powers available to lawmakers and how decision-making happens at the EU level, an emissions trading system made the most sense as a mechanism to help achieve net reductions over time in these industries. It's like doing the best with the system that we have.
Last episode, we touched on compliance systems in broad terms, and the EU ETS is just one example of how these work.
I mean, they're essentially cap and trade system. So you set a cap and there's a trajectory how it should be coming down over time. So it reduces, which means you are reducing emissions. They cover emissions, that's why they are called emissions trading systems. They typically don't cover removals because then they would be called emissions and removals trading systems. It's obviously mandatory, it's a compliance system, it's part of the regulation. No one can opt out by themselves. If they have to be covered, they're covered. And they have to monitor how much they emit every year. And then they have to cover all their emissions next year with allowances, which is then the unit of 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. So that's kind of a very simple way how it works. The challenge, I think the limitation we're starting to see these days, we have obviously learned a huge deal about how to run these systems. We had major issues when we went through different ways of deciding how these allowances should be allocated. We got things wrong several times in the beginning. We were facing, allowance prices of €5 for quite a while, and it felt like it will never change. But now, we've been back to the point where the price went at some point over €100, and now it's back down. I think it's around 60 or 70. So we got it to work. But the problem now is that this cap is going down and it is eventually going down to zero. And we do know that in reality, all these companies covered by the system, like there is no way that they will have zero emissions. So what will need to happen is adjusting emission trading systems with the reality of the net zero world. And how it will look like, that's something now that several jurisdictions are looking into. The EU is also thinking, we are expecting a proposal from the European Commission in 2026 on how some types of removals could have a role in the EU ETS. And then in which way it's going to be played. Of course, there are very many different ways you can approach it. But I think the biggest question everyone is facing is how to keep the integrity of the ETS, and by that, how to keep the focus of the ETS on reducing emissions, while also then catering for this reality that we need to have net zero emissions and removals will have to start playing the role.
It's good to remember that CDR actually plays a really important role when it comes to climate policy. As we get closer to net zero targets, more and more industries are going to find it difficult to continue to decarbonize, particularly at this pace. So if we integrate CDR into the picture, it's a way to keep the targets alive and viable, and to ensure that we don't cause economic damage by essentially banning large parts of the economy, as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Still, the question of whether removals can find their way into the ETS, or whether the EU would be better served by a separate reductions trading system, remains to be answered. Lucky for us, the EU is moving at lightning speed with this discussion. I'm joking, that's just not how the EU roll.
The discussion around the integration of carbon removal is progressing with a lot of diligence and fairly slowly. The proposal by the European Commission will be out in July 2026, and the earliest integration will be 2031, and it will be a phased integration. So this is really something that will happen slowly, but it will still be a complete game changer. Because the one thing carbon removal is missing right now is predictable demand. And emission trading systems create a predictable demand for decades ahead. Because you know how the cap is changing, right? So if you're a startup, you can go to an investor and show them not just a fictionary hockey stick, but one that's actually based on the real demand generated by emission trading systems. And we know, for example, that today, the EU is generating around 40 billion in revenue every year from its ETS, which is huge, 40 billion. And if you compare it to the size of the global voluntary carbon market for removals, which I think was just shy of 2 billion, it's just in Europe 20x bigger.
This all sounds very promising if it works in the way we need it to. It bears repeating, trading systems have not always worked seamlessly. They've got themselves a bad name in the past for allowing low quality credits, lack of transparency, over-crediting, and many other issues.
Emily, fear not. I have more initials here to save the day. Enter the CRCF.
I knew we just needed some fresh new letters in here and we'd be fine. I knew it.
You can thank me later. But the CRCF, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, is a proposed EU regulation to certify and standardise carbon removals, ensuring their quality, transparency and traceability. Here's Elizabeth Harding, Policy Manager at the Negative Emissions Platform, a Carbon Removal Show coalition member.
So the CRCF is really the EU standard of what they see as a high quality carbon removal credit. This is really a world first and is a very, very welcome piece of legislation. So the aim is how to really tap it into other pieces of legislation. So how can we integrate, for example, CRCF into potential ETS integration? Because these units have multiple purposes. They could be used on a voluntary market. They could be used by member states when it comes to funding, but it also could be sort of compliance markets purposes. So really we've now got the piece of legislation was adopted, it's been agreed upon, and now we're really entering into the implementation phase. And it's really important that we get this right. So we know that there will be the first draft methodologies. So we will have methodologies for direct air capture and storage, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and biochar carbon removal. So it's really great that we're seeing this progress already in the implementation. But then there's also needs to be clarity on the methods that aren't covered in the first round of methodologies and creating some sort of certainty for them, because they also will have impact on how they sell or how they talk to their potential buyers. And a lot of their buyers are interested, will you have a CRCF methodology or not? And that could really impact their business development. So it's just really important that we have that clarity from the Commission so that we create more certainty for the market as well.
So the CRCF seeks to create a common EU standard, setting clear rules and definitions for what counts as good carbon removal. As such, it lays the foundation for future incentives, creating a stepping stone toward integrating removals into policy and markets.
Yeah, it's great to have the big hitters covered, your DACs, your BECs, your biochar. But as Elizabeth says, we'll also need methodologies for the other CDR techniques that tend to get less airtime.
Yeah, I mean, we cannot leave them behind, can we?
We can't.
No method left behind.
And then there's also the question of credits generated outside the EU, which currently fall outside the CRCF's purview.
There's many reasons why carbon credits from outside the EU will be needed, but there has to be a level playing field, and we shouldn't be allowing less quality credits to enter the market. So there needs to be some sort of level playing field to allow for international credits. Just to focus on the CRCF, there is a revision clause in the legislation where basically it will have to be revised next year and it has to consider the international dimension. So it might be the case that they will revise the international scope and that it will allow international credits in the future. It's not for sure, but they are revising this or they're reviewing this.
So, although it might feel as though things are moving at a snail's pace, there's a lot to look out for. We expect major movement over the coming months and years on the ETS, the CRCF and more, including the broader ways that the EU is handling removals.
Yeah, I endeavour to employ a large dollop of patience on these matters. Find some trust for the process.
Trust is a must in this process.
And Ava also mentioned the 2040 target. That's the key intermediate step between the 2030 target that we're currently working towards and that 2050 net zero date. This has been delayed a bit, but apparently we can expect to see something this summer. So there's always things to look forward to, Tom. I hope you don't have any summer plans because there's lots going on already.
It's going to be a hot CDR summer.
I hope it's not too hot because I do worry when the climate does weird things,
Across the pond from the EU, the world's biggest economy has in recent years taken a very different approach to supporting CDR.
Oh, I believe, Tom, you're referring to yet another initialism. USA, United States of America. Ding ding on the initialism counter, please. It's got to be an overdrive at this point, I reckon. Might have broken it.
Yeah, we are double digits for sure. Now, perhaps it goes without saying, but there is a very big caveat here. Anything in the US could change at any moment. We live in uncertain times.
You don't have to tell me, Tom. I feel the uncertainty in my bones right now. It's a wonder I can stand up for this long to do this recording. But you're right. Quite literally, things are changing by the hour, which obviously makes doing a segment on US CDR policy a bit of a fool's errand, you might say. But here, Call us fools because we're doing it anyway. Strap in. Come on our foolish roller coaster with us.
Fool us once, twice, 3 times, whatever it is. I think there are a few truths that still hold, though, and they're still likely to hold for some time, you would hope. While the EU has taken a broadly top-down approach, you might say more stick than carrot, the US has generally tended to focus on financial incentives to drive innovation from the bottom.
Yeah, which, to be honest, is kind of characteristic of the broader political landscape in each context, US versus EU. Another way of looking at this, and to refer back to last episode, is that while much of the policy the EU is developing is aimed at the demand side, US policy is firmly focused on the supply.
If you've followed US carbon removal or energy-related policy from afar, you're also likely to have heard of both the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and the 45Q tax credit.
I actually looked it up, Tom, and 45Q doesn't really stand for anything, which is upsetting. But maybe it's just like Q from James Bond. That also doesn't stand for anything. It's just Q. You know, it's not like he's actually called Quentin or something. It's just Q.
Who knows?
45 quack quack.
45 quacks.
Quack quack tax credit.
The quack tax. Right.
Quack tax.
The quack tax. Here's Varsha Ramesh Walsh, CEO and co-founder of Offstream, another of our coalition members.
In 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. It was broad. It had jobs initiatives. It had energy sector allocations. It kind of like pulled on the really like a bipartisan bill that really pulled on the priorities of groups across agriculture, across like labor and construction, across energy, and across like clean tech. And the most notable and like the headline kind of marquee incentive that everyone got excited about on the removals front was the 45Q tax credit, which had 2 arms. So the first was a utilization credit. So if you capture carbon and you utilize it, so that could be utilizing it in any product. It could be capturing carbon and selling it to Coca-Cola to produce their sodas. That's $85 per ton of carbon. So that was like an upgrade from what it previously was. And then if you were capturing that carbon and storing it, the government was willing to pay $180 per ton of carbon.
So, the 45Q tax credit has been around for a while, 2008 to be precise. But as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, its incentives were boosted, broadened, and extended. In other words, bigger, bolder, better tax credits for more eligible facilities through to 2032. And this dramatically improved the business case for certain CDR projects.
I think it drew tons of folks on the carbon capture front to develop in the US. And we saw over the 2022 to 2024 increasing guidance from the IRS and the Department of Energy on how to actually claim that credit. 45Q was mostly focused on like engineered capture and storage. So things like biochar and nature-based removals were not particularly included in it, but there has been a lot of work to expand it to include that, and that work continues.
The result of all this is that the US has become arguably one of the most attractive places in the world to build and scale engineered carbon removal solutions.
Yeah, I guess from a financial standpoint, you're not wrong. And the key word here, I think, as Varsha touched on, has been very much engineered. You know, other policy initiatives have reinforced this, such as the famous DAC Hubs program, funded under the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. This allocated billions of dollars of funding towards a small number of regional direct air capture hubs in order to demonstrate the technology at a commercial scale.
And I think what's really characteristic of the US approach here is that many of these initiatives have really tied scaling this industry to other economic goals, like job creation. There are obviously upsides to that, including that it's much easier to garner support across the political aisle. But the lack of a clear regulatory framework for CDR can also risk uncertainty.
I think that a pro of this approach is that if you're an organization that has a lot of funding and talent and interest in pushing forward what you're working on, like you can spend those resources to get your project into the world, find like voluntary investors and voluntary buyers that are interested in supporting it, and you can kind of like brute force your way into the market and develop a project. And so that's what a lot of direct air capture folks did in the US because there isn't like a standard for that, or it wasn't when they came to market. I think the downside of it is that it makes all of carbon removal more risky or perceived as more risky. And so it limits the number of participants. So the benefit of standards and regulations are that corporates that might not have the time and resources to build like a full in-depth carbon removal buying team or the interest in doing so kind of have some framework that they can participate in. And the risk is mitigated by the government taking a role. And I think at the moment that we're in the market today, a blocker is that the US government and generally like national governments have really taken a long time to define any sort of like regulated market.
I think that you can begin to see here that with different policy focuses, you do get different outcomes. I know that sounds kind of like an obvious point, but I do think it's worth stating, like policy makes a big difference. The US approach of essentially channeling finance towards scaling engineered solutions does mean that you're going to see a proliferation of that sort of project. And the US has been leading the way when it comes to DAC so far. But you can also see where there are gaps. Buyers and funders need certainty. And without building that policy infrastructure, which, as we know, takes time, you're going to face roadblocks.
I'm glad you said it's important, Emily. Otherwise, I think it might have been a bit of a waste to do a 3-part mini-series on policy. So,
if it doesn't make any difference, why are we here?
Exactly. And to add to this, as we caveated at the start, there are big questions about what the future of CDR in the US looks like. Varsha gives her perspective.
I would say policy has taken a real beating here for CDR in the last 6 months, but it's okay. The 2022 Inflation Reduction Act created not only tax credits, but also just a lot of DOE, Department of Energy, which is our National Department of Energy, DOE-led grant programs, loans, and initiatives that were really focused on specifically carbon capture and direct air capture. And I think that was because the US government really viewed it as their role to invest in what could be the next solar PV. But there's just, since Trump took office, a lot of noise against some of those policies. And so it's been a little bit of let's wait and see what actually was preserved from that 2022 bill and what isn't. And so I think the areas that are most affected policy-wise are on the grant and loan part of what we do, less so tax credits. But our customers that we work with, myself personally, I think we are a bit waiting for the next couple of months to pass and to see what of the new administration's priorities actually come to fruition. There are lots of congressional protection measures that limit the new administration from fully repealing the IRA. It wasn't just a casual executive order. It was a bill that was passed with bipartisan support in both houses of our Congress. And so that usually means things are protected, but that's why I describe some of the last 6 months as a little bit more noise, but just generally wait and see.
It's all pretty terrifying, to be honest. TBH. A lot of the new administration's focus so far has been on removing environmental protections and regulations, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, deleting climate-related information from federal websites, and overhauling policies that sought to protect land, air, and water. It's all terrifying.
But fortunately, silver lining alert, the DAC Hub's funding was initially paused, but has since been unpaused, and the 45Q tax credit remains in place, shielded to some degree by its bipartisan support. The hope is that because much of this stuff is ostensibly pro-business, as well as pro-climate, it won't face quite the same fate as climate policies that some see as holding business back. But obviously that's not our framing, it's theirs.
But as we record this episode, so much is still uncertain. So how is all of this affecting the people working in CDR right now?
I'm seeing the policy uncertainty affect them and their ability to raise more capital. So for folks who have already raised maybe for their next something like $10 or $15 million, they have capital to build a couple of sites and kind of focus on that in the near term. These policy changes are noisy, but they're not affecting their ability to keep going with the day-to-day operations. It limits them from necessarily having a super clear path forward, but I'm seeing that most of those folks get quite creative and find alternate value streams for what they're working on. So like a biochar developer who maybe wasn't selling their biochar in their first project site is really focused on finding and speccing their biochar to be useful in an asphalt mix for their next site. So I'm seeing that they're folks, it's not crippling people in that category. For projects that are not funded, it has delayed them 6 to 12 months. They were really close to finishing something maybe in October, but investors told them to hold off because they wanted to see how the election would play out. Then November happened and investors said, we don't actually know what's going to change. And then January came around. And so in short, I think deals are getting delayed on that front, and it's really just pushing timelines out.
So essentially it's a wait and see game when it comes to the US.
It's a lot of waiting and seeing, and lots to keep an eye on beyond the main headlines that we've covered here. The somewhat piecemeal nature of US CDR policy means that we're often looking at different areas of policy to get the full picture, rather than one or two big pieces.
Yeah, beyond 45Q, there are National Science Foundation grants that support early stage innovation. There's the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, which offers loan guarantees and direct loans for high-impact energy and climate projects. And there's the US Department of Agriculture, which has worked to support soil carbon sequestration and soil amendments like biochar, to name just a few.
Right. And it seems each program is likely going to face different challenges and opportunities over the coming months and years. So set your Google alerts or any other alert feature you use.
Other options are available. We will send you a messaging pigeon at your request. On the subject of upcoming changes, it's also important to bear in mind that a great deal of US policy is decided at the state level. Thank bloomin' goodness for that. While the new administration has tried to limit states' powers when it comes to setting climate targets, we'll likely continue to see a lot of initiatives in particular states emerging to support CDR, and we'll be touching on that more in the next episode. So that's the US and the EU and the UN. The US and the EU, there's really it seems that there's a real disparity between those approaches. I do wonder if overall one approach is better than the other, or if they both have their ups and downs.
There's pros and cons to both, and I don't know. I'm sensing a blog post coming up on that comparison soon.
Interested to read your insights, Tom.
Yes, I'll let you know when I've put pen to paper.
Listeners, sign up to our newsletter to hear Tom's musings. Or follow us on LinkedIn and we'll let you know when it's out.
I guess that commits me to a date. Thanks, Emily.
You can't do it now. We've said you will.
I shall try my best.
I'm sure you will. We are guilty as a community, perhaps, of focusing on the geographies we've just discussed. Probably because that's where most of the money and advanced policy is. But we know there's more stuff out there to keep an eye on.
We'll explore a couple of examples in more depth next episode. For now, here's Shilpika Gautam, CEO and founder at Opna, another of our coalition partners, who'll be whizzing us through a few of the big developments out there, particularly when it comes to carbon markets.
In the UK right now, we're talking a lot about the UK emissions scheme, so the compliance scheme, how does that play out? In Japan, the Japanese compliance market is probably going to be huge. We're seeing a lot of developments there. Singapore has committed to carbon removal and trading, not just with private entities, but actually other governments. We're seeing countries like India, for example. I'm in India right now, and the Indian government is trying to figure out the Indian carbon compliance market. Definitely there are markets where opportunities exist and opportunities are being created because countries understand that carbon removal is not a question of do we do this? It's more a question of we can do this. And if we set the rules, we have the ability to create a new industry, which is not just about carbon, it's about employment, it's about social economic opportunity, and it's about a transition that's coming, whether you like it or not.
Most people we speak to in the industry, quite understandably, are most preoccupied with the policy agenda where they operate or where they do the most business. And for a lot of the CDR world, that's still the EU or the US, even if CDR outside of these regions is growing.
Mm-hmm. However, because these countries are a little smaller and can often be more politically agile, perhaps we should be looking to them for signals of what may be on the horizon and to do the piloting and proof of concept when it comes to more ambitious policy initiatives.
Totally. One country that came up a lot in our conversations was Switzerland. Switzerland became one of the first countries in the world to explicitly legislate for carbon removal as part of its national net zero strategy, and a recent directive requires all non-agricultural companies to submit 5-year milestone plans showing how they will reach net zero, and that includes their use of CDR.
Nice. Nice one, Switzerland. And all done with a democratic mandate, thanks to its participatory democracy. Whoever said climate laws couldn't be popular, eh? Eh?
Not me. I mean, imagine this sort of progress replicated in other countries. That would be mega news for CDR.
And you, Tom, would probably never shut up about it.
I don't know if I'm going to be a bit dried up from policy chat after all these episodes.
Last episode, we also reflected on how so much of this CDR policy stuff is a sort of ongoing negotiation between these huge global ambitions and the very real, on-the-ground realities we face at the national or even local level. We came across many reminders of this during our chats, and although this episode has obviously looked at the EU at the supranational level and the US at the federal level, it's worth remembering that states and nations within these also face their own challenges and their own opportunities on their paths to net zero.
And just to give you a taster, here's Carbon Gap's Sylvain Delers, who spoke to us about what's been happening in France.
In France, we have a series of laws that describe the way the country has to define its what we call the low carbon strategy. So that would be the main document where the country outlines how it intends to reach the climate targets that are enshrined into law. So France aims for carbon neutrality by 2050, and right now we are in the phase of updating of the low carbon strategy. Up to now, the country has relied very heavily on the natural sinks and particularly its forests. So in the second version of the low carbon strategy, the country was anticipating volumes around 80 megatons of CO2 of residual emission by 2050, and most of this was neutralized using the capacity of forest and natural ecosystem to remove carbon out of the air. In between this second version and where we are now, there has been a major decline in the capacity of the forest. So I think in around 2020, it was still removing between 30 and 40 megatons per year. And now it has fallen to around 20, and projection tells us that it will keep falling further, potentially reaching only 9 megatons of CO2 per year. So that's a real challenge, because if you relate this projected 80 megatons CO2 that would be remaining at the point of net zero, with only 9 remaining from the forest, this just doesn't work. So in this last version of the low carbon strategy, the country acknowledged this situation and proposed ways of trying to help the natural sink recover. But interestingly, the country has always been quite reluctant in engaging with novel CDR, so that more permanent CDR methods. And it's still the case. So in the last version of the text, there's very little about diversifying the carbon sinks that would be used to reach net zero, and particularly very little on novel CDR. So that's one thing we've been advocating for. France has potential for this novel CDR. We have documented this in a study that we published in 2024. France has potential to reach and secure its objective of carbon neutrality, but it could even go beyond. So we calculated that with existing resources and without challenging the existing uses of these resources, France could, with some ambition, reach almost 140 megatons of CO2 removed every year by 2050. So that would be almost double what they would need to reach net zero. At the same time, the country is doing a decent job at cutting emissions, and they are now on track, reducing almost 5% per year. So it's really now the lack of carbon removal or carbon sinks that is threatening the climate target that the country has, and particularly the net target for 2030, which is minus 55% in the EU. This one might be missed for France just based on the lack of carbon removal.
I think this just underscores the complexities of what we're talking about here. Every country, every region has its own unique context.
Yeah, and we've talked about this in the past in terms of the right CDR for the right place. DAX where there's abundant renewable energy, or reforestation where there's plenty of suitable land. But we can't forget that everywhere has its own political reality as well.
Yeah, totally agree. So as well as championing some of these bigger policy pushers at the UN or EU, for instance, perhaps we should also be mindful and open to the idea of the right policy for the right place. Each country's contribution to scaling CDR might look a little different or face its own challenges. And for that, we really need an army of thousands of engaged citizens across the world, policymakers, advocates, and experts who can help bring this patchwork of effective policy into being. Well, that's a bit of a mammoth episode, but we've done pretty well, I reckon. I'm really looking forward to diving into some more examples of CDR policy in the next episode. I think it's important to mention that we're not ever going to be able to talk about every policy that mentions or affects CDR. It's just not possible. We're only human. But maybe, listeners, if you're interested, you can go away and have a little research for yourself. Let this be your launch pad, as it were.
Yeah. I think this episode has played a really good role at teeing up some of the larger, more headline-orientated policy developments that we will continue to see develop as the years go on. But like you say, Emily, there's so much more beneath the surface of UN policy, US policy, etc. And alongside the listeners being able to do their own research, we are going to be diving into some super interesting developments in the third and final installation of our policy mini-series.
And for those listeners who maybe are feeling a little bit helpless after this episode, I know that that's how I get when I dive into policy stuff sometimes. We're also going to be looking at how you can get involved, and maybe there's some things that you can do, some things that we can all do to support the advancement of CDR policy in the way that we want it to go.
Totally. And that doesn't mean you have to work for a carbon removal company.
Just means you have to listen to the Carbon Removal Show and pass on the episodes that you like to people who can do things about it. That's one thing you could do for sure.
Let's wrap this up and see you in the next episode.
BRB.
TTYL.
TTFN.
LMFAO. Thank you for listening to the Carbon Removal Show.
Please subscribe if you haven't already and follow us. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads. It helps so much.
And if you could do me this one favour, share this podcast with a friend or a colleague who might resonate with this episode.
A huge thank you to all our coalition members, without whom the Carbon Removal Show would not be possible.
B0, Carbon Engineering, Carbon Gap, Carbon Future,
ClimeFi, Ivatama, Klarna, Mashmakes,
Milky Wire, Negative Emissions Platform, OPNA,
Patch, Pinwheel, Plan Boo, Recarber,
Sebastian Manhart, Standard Gas Technologies, Supercritical, and Offstream.
If you or your company are interested in joining this amazing coalition, please get in touch.
The Carbon Removal Show is hosted by me, Tom Praviti.
And me, Emily Swaddle.
And produced by me, Ben Weaver-Hinks.